Hey guys, since you all liked the last RPG video so much, I decided to do it again, but in Calamity this time. I chose to do it in Calamity mainly because I figured I could get a weapon to do way more damage. And I was right. The amount of damage you saw in the thumbnail, real. It was on a different weapon, but 100% real. I managed to get a weapon to do over 1 billion damage, but that's not all. Come follow me, come take a look at this. See this cute little guy, my cute little drone boy? He is a stone cold killer. One touch from this guy and all that's left is a pile of flesh. Some might ask me why I call my adorable little buddy a stone cold killer, and all I have to say is that he does over 4 million damage. 4 million damage. But he's not the only one who does that much damage. Every single enemy that you see here has millions of health, hundreds of millions of health, billions of health, and will kill me in just one single hit. Just one tiny hit. Hell, even the slimes from the beginning of the game will one-shot me. But anyways, watch me go from a small minimum wage worker to a level 1000 mafia boss. As soon as I spawned in, I opened my starter bag and was overwhelmed by everything inside of it. It mostly consisted of starting gear for each class. I ended up choosing the amethyst staff just because it did the most damage, but I ended up switching to the bow after about 10 seconds of mining. Mining on day 1 was rough. It was very, very rough because everything had double my health and dealt double my damage. Some enemies would be too big for me to run away from and others would be too small for me to hit, but nevertheless I persevered and managed to get a shit ton of ore, and it was so much. On day 2 I finished mining and headed to the surface to start my house. I like to make my house look different every time I do a new playthrough of this game, so I decided to make my very own fallout shelter underground. After making my room of the bunker, I got to smelting ores into bars, and I was not exaggerating about how much ore I had. I had so much, I was able to make a platinum bow and full tungsten armor after my first trip while mining, and I still had 50 tungsten bars left. On day 3, I noticed that I can just craft a slime staff, so I did that. Okay, enough about normal Terraria stuff, now it's time that I got to the RPG aspect of this playthrough. I was initially going to use a different mod like Level Plus instead of using another RPG mod again, but I just couldn't find another mod that did all the cool shit that another RPG mod does. In the skill tree, I began going down the path of the ranger, more so the path of an archer, and in the stats menu I was putting every single point into health so that I wouldn't die as much. Afterwards, I got to cleaning all the blood, slime, and arrows from the night prior, and I had forgotten how satisfying it is to clean. I then spent most of my day looking for a pair of fledgling wings, and I eventually found some. When night arrived, I fought the Eye of Cthulhu, mainly because getting full tungsten armor right away made me very, very cocky. After fighting this boss for like 3 whole minutes, I was able to defeat it on day 4 with only a scratch or 2. I then used the Crimtane bars to make a tendon bow and save the rest for when I defeat the Brain of Cthulhu. Afterwards, I spent a bunch of time cleaning because the fight with the Brain of Cthulhu had stained my platforms completely red. They weren't even brown anymore. Once that was done, I spent the rest of the night working on my bunker and adding some NPC housings to it. On day 5, I began exploring to the right of my world in hopes of finding a cave. Not that I needed ores or anything, but because I still hadn't found a cloud in a bottle or Hermes boots or just any beginning game stuff like that. On my way there, I noticed that I had completely forgotten to turn on Revengeance mode, so I did that, but my bad. Eventually, I ended up finding a cave in the jungle, but this place was scary. It was just crawling with enemies that I was not ready to fight at all. After traumatizing myself in the jungle, I went to an equally as bad place to start preparing for the Desert Scourge fight, the Underground Desert. I spent the rest of the night down there getting the materials I would need to summon the Desert Scourge. On day 6, I began my fight with the Desert Scourge, and because of how little damage I do, it took me 7 full minutes to defeat this thing. 7 entire minutes. This boss fight should only take me like a minute or 2. After finally defeating it, I went home and wondered if the archer life was really for me. I needed a weapon that could hit multiple enemies at once so that I could just level up super duper fast, but the only weapons that really do that are magic weapons. So from this day forward, I think I'm just going to stay as a mage. I ended up switching my weapon to the Storm Spray that I got from the Desert Scourge, and I ended up resetting all of my points in the skill tree and used them to unlock the Mage class. It gives me 40% increased magic damage, 20% decreased mana cost, but at the cost of 15% of my health. I started day 7 off with making more NPC housing, and then I spent the entirety of the day looking for the dungeon so that I could grab a few books, make a bookshelf, and craft the Coral Spout, a magic weapon that casts a shotgun-like blast of coral shards. Now this weapon looked super duper cool. It reminded me of Starlight River with how cool it looked, but it did barely any damage when I tested it on the enemies in the Crimson. It did like nothing. I spent the morning of day 8 researching new weapons to make, and the one that caught my eye was the Magna Cannon. So I spent the entire day mining, looking for both a granite cave and an extractinator because I needed granite and amber to make it. After like an entire day of looking, I eventually found a granite cave, but I had yet to find the extractinator. But during all of that time, I did find a giant shell that gives me 10 defense, so that was pretty cool. I spent all of day 9 looking for an extractinator, and when I finally found one after like 20 minutes of looking, I only got 4 out of the 5 amber that I needed, so I needed to go back down and get like more silt or something. On day 10, I went looking for the silt that I needed, and when I had about 100 more, I came back up, extracted it all, and made the Magna Cannon, a magic weapon that fires a concentrated blast of energy. As soon as I made this weapon, a zombie waltzed right into my home, and I exercised my 5th Amendment right to defend my property. So I shot it point blank with this new weapon, and it worked wonderfully. I then spent some time making magic storage, and it was just so nice to be organized again. I had everything just thrown in like 4 chests. It was awful. After the magic storage was done, I spent the rest of the day defeating and farming the King Slime for the slime mount because he just wouldn't drop it. On day 11, I went to go fight the Desert Scourge, but since I'm on Revengeance mode now, it has way more health. Like 60,000 health, so I ended up giving up on fighting it because I just don't do enough damage and I don't want to spend that much time on it. Instead of fighting the Desert Scourge, I went to the spider cave that I found earlier, set up a water candle, and got to farming for levels. After a little bit, I got my Magna Cannon to ascend, and it went from doing 41 damage to 56. While I was leveling and upgrading my weapon, I was getting really annoyed with how little mana I have, so I went to the surface to get a shackle because I wanted to make a regeneration band. I managed to get a shackle on day 12 and turned it into a regeneration band, which I was gonna turn into a mana regeneration band, but I realized that I need a Tinker's Workshop to do so. After wasting a bit of time, I decided that it was finally time to go to the Sunken Sea and defeat the Giant Clam to get the NPC that comes from the Giant Clam. So I mined all the way through the underground desert, and when I finally got there and hyped myself up for the fight, I was just so let down at how easy it was. It was definitely no Inferno mode Giant Clam. The only annoying part about fighting the Giant Clam was that it was just taking me so long to defeat it, but after a bit I did defeat it and got the NPC Amidias. I wanted him because I knew he sold some magic weapons for me to try out. I bought the magic weapon that he sold, and I also decided to get the Enchanted Conch, a summon weapon that summons a little hermit crab to fight for you. On day 13, I tested the hermit crab on the horde of clams that were below me, and it worked really well. Like really well. The weapon ascended after like 2 minutes of fighting these guys. And then I got an idea. What if instead of leveling up magic weapons, I leveled up summon weapons instead? What if instead of being a mage, I just switched to a summoner? I'll have to test it out more, but it was definitely an idea on my mind. Afterwards, I decided to try out the Victide armor set, but I still needed more materials from the Desert Scourge, so I defeated it again. After making the armor set, I noticed that it didn't really do much. It just gave me a bunch of buffs that are only available underwater, but I still wanted to give it a shot, so I spent the rest of the night getting the shit beat out of me to level up the armor. I also put a bunch of stat points into health and a bunch of skill points into intelligence. I started off day 14 fighting the Brain of Cthulhu. I did this because I was hoping for some tissue samples from defeating the Hungry, but I forgot that they don't drop anything because it's Revengeance mode. After that, I spent some time researching weapons because I can't help but feel my weapon just isn't doing that good. And I ended up finding a weapon called the Harvest Staff that seemed promising, but it required pumpkins, so I bought some seeds from the Druid and got to farming. I spent most of my time after that pretty much just waiting for the pumpkins to grow. While I was waiting for it, I made more NPC housing and tested out a ranged weapon to see if it could be any good, but it just wasn't. Once the pumpkins had grown, I made the Harvest Staff and got right to farming enemies for levels, and it was working out pretty great. Right off the bat, it did pretty decent damage anyway, so after leveling up, it was just going to do more. I continued leveling up and upgrading this thing for the rest of the night. I ended up spending the next 3 days down in the Spider Cave and in the Sunken Sea just upgrading this weapon. I ended up getting to level 50 during this time and changed my class from the Mage to the Archmage, which gives me a 75% increased magic damage, 30% decreased mana cost, but at the cost of 20% of my health. After farming for 3 entire days and ascending my weapon, it now does over 250 damage. Over 250 damage, that's like quintuple the amount of the last weapon. I defeated the Brain of Cthulhu super early on day 18, and as soon as I defeated it, I also decided to beat the Perforators just right after. After defeating them both, I got the Blood Clot Staff, a summon weapon that summons a blood clot, and I made the Blood Bath, a magic weapon that drenches enemies in blood. What I didn't know was that both of these weapons were also going to drench my entire house in blood. It was soaking the wooden floors. During this I also made crimson armor. Afterwards I spent a long time wondering why none of the cool modded NPCs were spawning, and I came to the realization that I forgot to add the mod. Like, I completely left it out. The AlchemistNPC mod was not in here right now. So I went and installed it, and after installing the mod I made more NPC housing for them and farmed enemies to upgrade the bloodbath for the rest of the night. On day 19 a goblin army finally attacked, but they were tough, but also good for levels, so I spawned multiple goblin armies and slaughtered many goblins for the entire day to increase my ever growing power. During all of this I spent a bunch of stat points, a bunch of skill points, upgraded my weapons, and upgraded my armor. I was still slaughtering the goblins for the entire morning of the next day, but afterwards I did what was right and cleaned my entire base and the surrounding area, and let me tell you, there was a lot of blood. After all the cleaning was done, I decided it was time to defeat the Skeletron, so I teleported to the beach on the left side of my world and totally forgot that there was a sulfurous sea in this mod. I completely forgot this was a biome. So I grabbed some of the acid wood and some sulfuric scales and headed towards the dungeon. It ended up taking a couple of minutes because it regrew its arms mid-fight, but I was able to defeat the Skeletron with nothing but a scratch. I spent the morning of day 21 exploring the dungeon. I ended up getting a Staff of Necrosteocytes, a summoner weapon that summons little tiny skeletons. But I didn't really need anything else from there, so I went back home to continue my elevator. Once I was in hell, I kind of just hopped into the lava to get hellstone instead of using obsidian skin potion because I have an absurd amount of health. Like, the lava was doing absolutely nothing to me. Once I had enough hellstone, I went home and made the Hellwing Staff, a magic weapon that casts flaming bats, and I made the Flare Bolt, a magic weapon that casts a slow moving ball of flame. To test both of these weapons, I went into the dungeon to farm some skeletons. I ended up doing this for the rest of the night, all of day 22 and most of day 23, and determined that the Hellwing Staff was better because it just shoots more projectiles despite its lack of damage. During all of this, I reached level 100 and was able to change my class from the Archmage to the Arcanist. It increases my magic damage by 125%, decreases my mana cost by 50%, but at the cost of 35% of my health. I also did a bunch of stat and skill tree points along with leveling the fuck out of my weapons. Once I was home, I spawned the Slime God and spent the rest of the night fighting it. I defeated the Slime King on day 24, but it took way too long to do it, so despite barely taking any damage, I knew I needed to level up everything much further. From the Slime God, I got the Eldritch Tomb, a magic weapon that casts Eldritch Tentacles to spear my enemies, and a Mana Polarizer, which just gives me a bunch of different mana related buffs. Now that I had Purified Gel, I decided to make the Carnage Ray, but I would need to gather a few materials first. The first of the materials being Amber, which I ended up buying, the second being Sturdy Fossils, which I extracted a bunch of desert fossils that I had gone earlier to get, and the third being a Crimson Rod, which I got by breaking the Heart Orb things in the Underground Crimson. All the Carnage Ray did was fire a Blood Ray, so I should have been skeptical, but I wasn't, and since I wasn't, I wasted a whole bunch of time on such a mediocre weapon. I ended up spending the rest of the night in the dungeon leveling up the Eldritch Tomb. I continued leveling up the Eldritch Tomb for the morning of day 25 because I really felt that this weapon could be really good, but the more time I spent on it, the more I realized that I was just wasting my time. At this point, I was just at a loss because I couldn't keep up with all the enemies and their ever-increasing difficulty, so after pondering for a bit about what I should do, I decided to make the corrupt version of the Carnage Ray, the Knight's Ray. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with all the same details on how to craft it because it's literally the exact same as a Carnage Ray, but with a Vile Thorn instead of a Crimson Rod. Once it was made on day 26, I noticed the difference between the Carnage Ray and the Knight's Ray. It was that when the Knight's Ray hits an enemy, the enemy will also be hit by a bunch of other rays from his sides instead of just one ray. After a bit, I remembered that I can make Statagel armor, but before I did that, I totally forgot about my stat points and had accidentally accumulated over 600 points. So I put every last one of them into my magic damage, and now my Knight's Ray does over 230 fucking damage. I then used the Slime God to upgrade my Knight's Ray until from one of the Slime God fights, I got this magic weapon named the Abyssal Tomb, and little did I know this weapon was going to change the entire course of this playthrough. This weapon casts a slow-moving ball of dark energy that explodes, and when it explodes, not only does it do a shit ton of damage, but it also earns me a shit ton of XP. I ended up spending the rest of the night leveling it up. I spent all of day 27 leveling this weapon up, and it was turning out to be a fucking super weapon. Like, in one day it went from 209 damage all the way to almost 2,000. It was absolutely insane. Not only was this weapon just absolutely amazing, but it also has a god tier skill tree. Look at how many ascended point slots there are. There are so many. I spent the morning of day 28 continuing to level up this weapon, and I got to deal over 3,000 damage. It's crazy how I went from doing like 300 damage with one weapon to over 3,000 damage with another one in like a day and a half. I was feeling unbelievably strong. So strong that I decided it was time to take on the Wall of Flesh and send this shit to hard mode. So I made an insta-bridge, went to hell, and defeated the Wall of Flesh in seconds. Well, sort of. As soon as I defeated it, my game got so overwhelmed by my raw power that it crashed. So I had to reload the game and then beat it again. After that whole fiasco, I went to the Crimson and started mining altars to get the Hardmode ores into my world, but I totally forgot that Calamity changes that, so I only got a bunch of souls in night. Afterwards, I went home and did a shit ton of research on what weapons I could possibly make, and one that stood out was called the Forbidden Sun, but it required scoria bars, and the only way to get scoria bars was to go deep into the abyss. Now, I had no clue if I could even mine it, but I went to the sulfurous sea and started sinking down it regardless. I ended up dying on my first try because the enemies down there are just so difficult, but on my second attempt I figured out that I was unable to mine this ore. I continued to do research on weapons on day 29 and decided to try out the trade winds, so I went to a sky island to grab some aerolite bar and some sun plates, dealt with a strong ass wyvern, and made the weapon, but it turned out to be ass. After some more research, I decided to just give up for now and get a bunch of palladium ore to make the palladium armor. I ended the day finally reforging all of my equipment. I spent the morning of day 30 in what I thought was my tundra biome, but I guess it's now the astral tundra, and I ended up getting a bunch of essences of Ulum to make the cryo key and fight cryogen. While I was down there, I got an ancient ice chunk, a summoner weapon that summons an ice clasper, and I got back to thinking that what if I switched to summoner? Would it be better? Would I be stronger? I decided to give it a shot. I spent the rest of the day using the slime god to level up and upgrade my ancient ice chunk, and I also switched my skill tree from mage to summoner. On day 31, I made full spider armor to get more summons, and after just half a day of grinding, my summons already did over 2,800 damage. Quite literally 4 more minutes of grinding later, and my summons did over 5,100 damage. And just 3 minutes after that, my summons did over 7,700 damage. This switching to summoner was the best idea I've ever had. After all this grinding, the slime god just wasn't doing it for me anymore, so I thought it would be a good idea to make a Zerg potion. A potion that vastly increases enemy spawn rates, and go into the dungeon to grind and just look at how long I lasted. After dying, I ended up going back and spent the rest of the night grinding, and by the end of the night, my summons did over 8,200 damage. I spent the morning of day 32 still grinding in the dungeon, and while I was there, I figured out that I can cheese the leveling system in this mod. When it comes to weapons, you can only level up the weapon you're currently holding, but if you go into your inventory and just grab the item, the mod thinks you're holding it in your hand, so you get all of the evolution points, but without the weapon ever going up in XP. Anyways, I was sick of the dungeon and I wanted a whip, so I went to the Astral Tundra and began farming the enemies the same way I did in the dungeon, and oh boy, were there a lot of enemies. I just wanted a single ice golem to spawn so that I could make a cool whip, but all that ever spawned were these stupid astral enemies, and there were just so many of them. I was leveling up so fast. After a bit of just sitting there and killing enemies, I ended up going home and grabbing my firecracker whip that I got from the Wall of Flesh and began upgrading that. I spent the rest of the day doing this, and while this happened, I realized that my minions gained a lot of XP really fast, like millions of XP in seconds. By the end of the night, my whip did over 9,600 damage, and my summons did over 16,000 damage. On day 33, I was able to defeat Cryogen, and he had a lot of fucking health, like a lot of health. This was probably the longest boss fight I've had yet. Once I was home, I realized that I had completely forgotten about my stat and skill tree, and had accidentally accumulated over 4,000 stat points. So I spent all of those and reworked my skill tree a bit because I found this skill that sets my armor to 0, but increases my summon damage by 1% for every point of armor I had. I got all 3 slots for that skill and it ended up increasing my summon damage by 3% for every point of armor I had in. Holy shit. This was the skill to end all skills. This skill brought my whip damage from 9,600 to 527,924, and my minion damage from 16,000 to 411,579. This was absurd. This was absolutely absurd. I ended the day by defeating and farming the Destroyer. After farming the destroyer, on day 34 both of my weapons were maxed out on levels, and after configuring their skill trees and using up all of the stat points that I had, my whip does 1,469,921 damage, and my minions do 981,154 damage. It wasn't even like, it was obviously surprising, but this is just too much damage. Afterwards, I decided that I should probably upgrade my boots to the Terraspark boots, so I spent most of the day getting the materials to do that. Once they were made, I spent the rest of the night farming both the twins and the Skeletron Prime, partially for their loot, but mainly just for funsies. I spent the morning of day 35 getting through all of the Hardmode ores, now that I have all the mechanical bosses defeated. While crafting with all these new ores that I had, I stumbled across a weapon that caught my eye. The Sun God Staff, which I'm pretty sure I mentioned earlier actually, I can't remember, but it's a summoner weapon that summons the Solar God Spirit to protect you. I happen to have all the materials, so I made it, and I was just stunned by how good this weapon performs. It started out with a base damage of 25,693, but after killing the Slime God just a couple of times, it already ascended 5 times. Even though I had the points to spend, I wanted this weapon to just utterly shock the shit out of me, so instead of using all the skill points that had been accumulating, I went to underground to grind the shit out of enemies for levels. By the time it had reached ascending tier 11, the weapon dealt 1,043,830 damage, and needless to say, I was absolutely stunned. I ended up taking my newfound power and used it to clean up my boss checklist for the rest of the night. The early hours of the next day were spent standing in one place as I watched my minions just demolish the pirate army. Afterwards, I ended up making the Durandal and decided that killing this Queen Slime would be a perfect opportunity to level this weapon up, and boy was I right. Just look at how many levels it got in a matter of seconds. At this point, my Ancient Ice Chunk dealt 1,552,597 damage, my Sun God Staff dealt 1,211,783 damage, and my Durandal dealt 32,258 damage, which isn't a lot, but I still need to level it up, so I went to the Sulphur Sea to defeat the Acid Rain event, and to get the materials required to summon the Aquatic Scourge. After a bit, I had everything that I needed to summon the Aquatic Scourge other than the shark fins, so I went to the ocean to get some, and while I was there, I accidentally summoned and defeated the Leviathan. Afterwards, I realized that my Durandal was getting absolutely nowhere, so I swapped the Firecracker back in. I then finally went and defeated the Aquatic Scourge and got the weapon called the Deep Sea Staff, a summoner weapon that summons an aquatic star to fight for you, and after leveling up for literally like 2 minutes, it went from dealing 21,084 damage to a whopping 2,647,494 damage, and that's just absolutely fucking crazy. I then spent the rest of the night getting the materials to summon the Brimstone Elemental. I began day 37 by spending over 2,000 stat points that I had accumulated over the last day or so. There was no way I was going to put all of those points in myself, so I got an auto-clicker to do it for me. Once all the points were spent, I went back down to Hell and defeated the Brimstone Elemental. From her, I got a couple of summoner weapons, but the only one that actually mattered was the Igneous Exaltation. It summons a blade to orbit around the user. You guys actually aren't even ready for this part. It started out dealing 23,902 damage, but after just a couple of minutes, it was at Ascending Tier 13 and dealing, I kid you not, 16,928,476. I actually don't know what to do. That's almost 17 million fucking damage. Once I was home, I put all other weapons into storage because of how good the Igneous Exaltation was. Well, except for the Sun God Staff. I kept that one, but only because it looked cool with all the orbiting blades. I then finished off my day going to the jungle and defeating the Plantera with no arena or anything. I just searched until I found the first bulb that I saw and then used it. I spent the morning of day 38 farming the fuck out of the Calamitas clone because the bestiary says it drops a summoner weapon, but after defeating it like 20 times in a row, it still hadn't dropped it, so I just gave up on it. I did end up getting and equipping the Void of Calamity for an extra 12% damage. Afterwards, I defeated the Old One's army, made Angel Treads, and reconfigured all of the skill points on my Igneous Exaltation, and it now does 82,771,160 damage, and it's just absurd that my damage is even nearing the hundreds of millions of soon. Not even a full 30 seconds into day 39, and I defeated the Golem, and honestly, I was getting kind of sick of this. Like, nothing could kill me, and I could kill everything in one hit. And my main weapon now dealt over 141 million damage. Things were just getting out of hand, but regardless, I went to the Mushroom Biome, got a Truffle Worm, and defeated Duke Fishron in another single hit. Afterwards, I went to the jungle to get a bunch of plague cell canisters to make the summon for the Plaguebringer Goliath, and after I had made it, a new weapon caught my eye. It was called the Wither Blossom Staff, a summoner weapon that summons 4 decaying flowers over my head. And this weapon was even better than the Igneous Exaltation. By the end of the day, this new weapon dealt 32,228,090 damage, but what made it even better than the Igneous Exaltation was the fact that it was homing. Each little petal from these flowers was homing. It was awesome. Oh, and by the way, during all this, I defeated the Plaguebringer Goliath. The next morning, I made the Plaguebringer armor set and officially started experimenting with the config to see if I could make the enemies and bosses any harder, and it turns out I actually can. After experimenting with it for a while, I honestly couldn't find any sort of sweet spot. The enemies were either too strong or too weak. I kept increasing the health of the enemies, and what I didn't realize was that since it's harder to kill things, my weapons will level up way faster than they were before. Like way faster than they were before. And honestly, I'll just let my past self explain all of this.
See, the shit just levels up so fast. Like, I'm trying to slow it down a bit, and it's just not working. How do I make things go by a bit slower? Oh, that's awesome. Why does it just do 0? Huh. I guess it does too much damage or something. Well, what am I supposed to do? Because I can't increase the enemy's health any further. Like, I just can't. We're gonna up all of that. See, now it's just like killing them just gives me more XP, and then I just level up faster. Like, the stronger they are, the stronger I end up getting. Like, this is absurd. I'm never gonna click through all of this. Like, I have everything done here. Every single summoner thing I have. Like, what else am I supposed to do now? Okay, let's just fucking see what that does. Okay, well now everything's impossible. This is essentially what I signed up for, I suppose. Yeah. Like, my weapon should not be doing 458,634,464 damage. Oh, sorry, I messed up. The number's 571,605,888. Sorry, I messed up. The number is 646,952,384. Sorry, what I meant to say was it is 786,574,592. I actually ran out of points. I can't get that one. That's okay, because I'm officially at 1,430,464. That is absurd. I do over 1 billion damage.
It had gotten to the point where, yes, the game was more challenging, but not challenging in a way where like the game is harder. It was more of a challenge on how long can I play the game before it just crashes. And with the lunar events going on, it was getting rough. My game had crashed so many times that the only way for me to get past the lunar events was to crank every setting in the config right back down to 1 and then do them. Once I had gone through all the pillars, on day 42 I was able to defeat the Moon Lord and finally put this all past me. But the one thing that annoyed me was that I still had the boss health in the config cranked all the way to 50, and even with that I still defeated it in 1 hit. So I guess it's just how it's gonna be for the rest of the playthrough. Afterwards, I spent the entire day gathering up Scoria Ore, Perennial Ore, and Cryonic Ore in order to make the Life Alloys so that on day 43, I could upgrade my Withering Blossom Staff to the Flowers of Mortality. For this weapon, I wanted to try the trick that I learned down in the dungeon like ages ago, like back at the beginning of the video. So I grabbed the weapon with my cursor and used my other summons to level it up, and oh my god. Once I was done, I had 11,393 evolution points and like 986 ascend points to use. So I ended up spending the next several minutes using only a fraction of these points, and it literally broke the weapon. Like, the weapon defaulted itself down to 0 damage, and it was bugging out every time I used it. Even though the weapon was obviously broken and not working right, I gaslit myself into thinking that it worked, and I continued to use it anyways. Afterwards, I finished off the night by defeating the Astrum Deuce. On day 44, I caved in and came to the conclusion that my Flowers of Mortality was just broken, so I spent some time and ended up making a new one to level it up the proper way. I spent some time leveling it up, and once it was done, it dealt 80,046,864 damage. Afterwards, I continued this playthrough by gathering up some unholy essences to make a Profane shard in order to defeat the Profane Guardians. But before I did that, I decided it was about time I make and wear some equipment that actually applies to me, actually applies to a summoner, instead of just continuing to wear stuff like a mana regeneration band. So I got to work on making Seraph Tracers and a Star Tainted Generator. I made the Seraph Tracers right away, but a part for the Star Tainted Generator required some pink gel, so I began fighting slimes right outside my house, and for whatever reason, they just kept multiplying. Like, I knew that enemies could multiply on occasion, but these slimes were multiplying like fucking rabbits, dude. They just kept on coming. By the end of the day, I still hadn't made the Star Tainted Generator. On day 45, I also started gathering parts for the Status's Curse, but none of it would matter because the absurdity of this mod would finally catch up to me. On this day, I left my world to make sure that saved because with this mod and the game crashing all the time, there have been parts that I've had to do over and over again. But when I tried to load back into my world this time, it just said load failed, so I ended up trying my backup and it still said load failed. At this point, I was just confused as to what happened to my world, so I went into the files of Terraria, and the file for my world it just vanished. It was completely gone. It was my breaking point. I seriously considered just ending the video here and saying, do not try this at home, because it will break your world and your heart, or something like that, but I decided to persevere and just make a new world. I spent the next 7 entire days just getting back to where I was on the other world. I made an effortless copy of the old house, I only defeated the bosses necessary to progress, and all in all it took me, I think about 2 hours to get back to where I was, which isn't that long. I mean it is, but it isn't. But I had nothing in my magic storage, and that was going to bite me in the ass later. But for now, on day 52, I went and defeated the Profane Guardians. I then ended up defeating Providence like almost immediately after, and I was just beating bosses left and right because I wanted this playthrough to be over with before I lost another world and had to restart again. While fighting Providence, I noticed that for some reason I only do like 1 or 2 damage unless I'm at like point blank range from an enemy or boss, so dealing damage was annoying as hell. Anyways, after defeating Providence, I spent the rest of the day underground getting Eulabloom ore. On day 53, I decided that I had enough Eulabloom ore and ended up making myself some Tarragon armor. Afterwards, I was trying to determine which weapon was better, the Stabber Staff, a summoner weapon that summons a Holy Blade, or the Virid Vanguard, a summoner weapon that summons a circular formation of blades. They were both really cool, but in order to determine a true winner, I went underground, drank a Zerg potion, and used the weapons one at a time, and it turns out that the Stabber Staff is better despite it doing less damage. Once that was all done, I wanted to get rid of the lunar pillars on my map just because they were bothering me, but in order to do so, I had to take them down. I took down the solar pillar without any issues, but as soon as I tried to do the Stardust pillar, my game would crash. It crashed over and over and over, and it really pissed me off, so I ended up giving up on the pillars for now, sat inside my bunker, and spent 16,311 skill points to calm myself down. After all the points were spent, I was feeling much better, and I went and defeated both Stormweaver and Cygnus. I wanted to defeat the Ceaseless Void on day 54, but the Stardust Pillar was right above the dungeon, and that was a pillar that was causing my game to just crash over and over again. I was kinda lost on what to do, but then I had the bright idea of just mining a tunnel from the Sulphurous Sea all the way to the dungeon, and it actually worked out. I was able to reach the dungeon arena and defeat the Ceaseless Void. On day 55, I went back to the dungeon arena and defeated the Poltergeist after killing 30 Phantom Spirits. Afterwards, I did the Acid Rain event so that Duke Fishron would spawn, and I ended up defeating him as well. Once that fish had been fried, I summoned the Devourer of Gods and ate its ass until it died. I then continued to eat its ass a few more times so that I would have enough materials to upgrade my Sun God staff to the Sirius. I also started using a weapon I got from the boss called the Staff of the Mechworm, a summoner weapon that summons an aerial mechworm. On day 56, I upgraded my Sirius to the Saros Possession in order to defeat both the Dragon Folly and Yaron. Afterwards, I officially got to work on my lab to summon the Exo Mechs. I then spent the next 11 days gathering up all the encrypted files from all the labs around the map, decrypting them, and building my machine. Super early on day 58, I ended up defeating the Supreme Witch Calamitaz as well. By the time it was the end of day 58, I had the machine almost complete. The only thing that was left was to decrypt the last file and make the Auric cooling cell. Since it was going to take a while for all the Draydon power cells to accumulate, I made my character sleep and I went to go do other things in the real world. When I came back like 45 minutes later, I still had nowhere near enough power cells to finish this, And since I just didn't want to wait hours probably to finish this last step, I loaded up the good old cheat sheet mod, grabbed 9,999 power cells, turned off the mod, finished my machine, and defeated the Exo Mechs. Since I had come this far, I decided that there was only one thing left to do: upgrade my Seros possession to its final form, the Temporal Umbrella, which is what I did on day 68, and it was the best weapon I could have ever made.